If you want the real non-sugar-coated rundown on inflation, I would recommend watching this video all the way through. Let's get right on into it. The inflation came out at 7.9%. It was March 10th. They just dropped the inflation rate of 7.9% on the CPI. I have a lot of really great information here on my screen I'm going to show you on a second when we do the screen share. Got a lot of charts and stuff like that that'll kind of expose what is really going on behind all the smoke and mirrors. But isn't it funny that they just can't seem to put 8%? If they had it their way, they would do 7.9995%, right? They don't want to get it to that 8% figure. Somehow it comes out at 7.9. You notice that with the CPI figures, they always try to use that 0.9. They use that 99-cent store tactic. It's funny. No way they're going to round it up to 8%, but we all know that it's much higher than that. At least that's my personal opinion, but I also have some facts to back that up, because if we use the CPI back in the 80s, well, why don't I just show you the chart and actually explain it on my screen here? We'll just get right on into it. As you can tell, I'm a little bit riled up as usual when these crazy figures come out. So this is the actual report from them. When you go through this, I wanted to specifically show 2008 to expose kind of what they did in 2008. In 2008, we're in this gray mark here is when we go through a recession. You'll see the little gray here, but we actually didn't go through a recession. They mark it as gray, but it wasn't a recession then. This was the last recession, was 2008. And you'll notice they were able to get this inflation rate that was up over 5%. They were able to get it to drop. And I'm going to show what they did to do that and why the Fed can't do it this time around. But this shows just how dramatic the growth was from where we were in January of 2021. We were at a 1.4% inflation rate. So there's December, January, 1.4%. From 1.4% up to 7.9% we are at now. Now, what's interesting is when you actually do the division and you go from February or from January 21 until January 22, you realize I went from 1.4% to 7.5%, now 7.9%. But from January 21 to January 22, January 2022, it went over 500% on that growth. So it's not just that we went up to a 7.9% CPI, it's the rate of growth. And when you realize that it was over 500%, 5x from January to January, from 21 to 22, that makes you realize that we haven't had that kind of growth on the CPI since the last time we went through stagflation. So one of the charts I wanted to show you real quick, we're going to get back to these over here, but I wanted to put this down for a second. This here on the left is from a site called Shadow Stats, which someone recently told me about, and I love that they actually did this information for us. So shout out to them. But they show what the CPI would be if we use the 1980s figures. So if they didn't change the things behind the scenes and showed us the actual CPI that was used last time we were in stagflation, it would show that we are actually above where we were when Paul Volcker had to raise the rates over 20% to stop inflation. And this just, it proves it right here. So here is the alternate CPI that they used from the 1980s based, and it's the blue line here. So this is what we're told, the red line, and still you see this sharp jump in inflation into that 7.9 figure here. But when you use the same CPI that they used back in the 80s, it shows that we are at 16%. I repeat, it shows that we are at 16%. So it just goes to show you that they use select things to show, and it doesn't show the full picture of what the real inflation is. But when you use the same data from the 80s, it shows that it's over 16%. The other chart I have over here that I wanted to show you is that rate of growth. And isn't it interesting? This whole time they were calling inflation transitory. That was just the number one word that you would hear the Fed use is transitory this, transitory that. But here you have in January 21, what I was just talking about, the 1.4% to the 7.5% figure here. Now, if you just do regular division here and you divide 7.5% by 1.4%, you get 535% that it went from this January figure up to the January of 2022 figure, which is just insane for a year-over-year growth. Just to put it into perspective, if we did another 5x jump like we did here, so this is a 5x jump on inflation, you do it one more time, you're into over 35% inflation. Now, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen next year, but I'm just saying that things compound. If they don't prove to be transitory, which obviously they're not transitory from what we've seen, then if we have a compounding situation, it starts getting very scary. Let me go back here. So as you can see, what we're told on the data on the CPI isn't the same data that we used last time we went through a stagflation. And I've argued on my channel, if you've been a subscriber on my channel, you know that I've been talking about stagflation for a while here, and it seems to be playing out a little bit, as well as the fact that the M2 supply. So if we go, let me go back to my screen over here. So they actually, ironically enough, they said this in the actual consumer price index report that came out. So this is the news release, and I wanted to go over this specific article here. I had it highlighted, but it says the all items index rose 7.9% for the 12 months ending in February. The 12-month increase has been steadily rising and is now the largest since the period ending in January 1982. So just like I was telling you before, this is, and ironically enough, that's when Paul Volcker raised the rates. So this is the last time we went through a stagflation crisis. We haven't experienced this sharp of a jump in the CPI since the last time we went through stagflation, which only proves the chart that I had just shown you with the shadow stats figure that we are on the same track that we had experienced it back in 1982. Isn't that ironic? Back when we had the same rate here, when you look at the blue, it was the 1982 figure. And then boom, we're right above it. So it plays out exactly as you would expect. But on the actual CPI data that they used back then, not on the CPI data that we're showing today, when you actually look at the real information, it shows exactly what they're saying here, that we have not seen this kind of growth since 1982. But there was something I wanted to bring up. And the first point I wanted to talk about was, and what caused stagflation last time was an oil crisis. And as we're seeing oil jump over 100 a barrel and it actually spiked up to 130. We're seeing a little bit of a pullback. I highly doubt that it's going to stay there. I think it's going to probably jump right back up and then some. But the one thing I wanted to bring up as well is the M2 supply. So when you show the M2, this basically shows the velocity of money. So how much people are spending money in the world right now. Are they holding it under their mattress? Are they storing their dollars under their mattress? Or are they actually spending it in the economy? And as you can see, this is when people are actually spending their money here. And this is back, we're looking at 2000. And so you see how much people used to spend money in the economy, and we're at all-time lows right now. The M2 velocity is down at 1.12. It's pretty much the lowest it's ever been, and that just shows you that people are sitting in dollars right now, which it would prove why the dollar index is showing so much strength. Now, as this inflation starts hitting and people start realizing just how bad it really is, and this report is one of those reasons, you're going to see people start flooding out of dollars into safe haven assets, but we'll talk about that in another video. If you want to subscribe to the channel, click the subscribe. But one of the things I wanted to bring up here is to get inflation to drop like they did before, they had to basically raise the federal funds rate. Well, they had the federal funds rate up rather, and they had to get rid of it and drop the federal funds rate down to zero. So this is the inflation rate. So how did they stop the inflation when we went through the recession? Keep in mind, this is actually when we went through a recession. We haven't gone through it yet. They're saying it's on their way. But this is when you're actually in recession. How did they stop it? And we'll pull up right here, July of 2008, you had a 5.6% CPI. Now, how did they stop it? Let's go to the federal funds rate. Let's go to July of 2008, just like we showed here. You'll see that in July of 2007, that is when we had the federal funds rate up at over 5%. Now, when you actually go through the inflation crisis, they were able, or the recession rather, they were able to drop the federal funds rate down. Ironically enough, you look at July of 2008, you had it at 2%. That's when they dropped it down to zero. So they used that tool in their tool chest at the Fed to drop the federal funds rate down and then down further. Ironically, exactly that July 2008, they went from 2% down to zero. Now, the problem is That works, right? But the problem is they've already done that. The only thing they could do is go into negative rates because they've already dropped it to 0% and they've had it at 0% for quite some time. So again, this was a tool that they used to get inflation down. So when you see the inflation rate, again, let's just go back to it. When you see this inflation rate at 5.6% in July of 2008, they had dropped it from 2% down to 0, and then that money was given away so cheap to the banks that then the economy flourished from that, and they were able to get that inflation number down. But we can't do that this time around, or the Fed rather can't do that because they've already used that tool. So again, they use the tool, drop it down to 0, but we've already used it. What can they do? Now, the next thing they'll do is they'll run QE to stop inflation, right? So here's your QE here. And in 2008, ironically enough, you'll see when you pull up that same time period, you pull up, this will be July of 2008, right? You see that they hadn't even bought anything. So the other tool the Fed has, besides dropping the rates down to 0, is to start buying up assets off of the market and running the printing press. So we saw that in 2008. Here's July, and then boom, they started running the printing press, and that's what helped the economy get back to normal. The problem is, look at how much they have bought. And I'm in the way here. Let me move myself out of the way just to show you how staggering it really is. They have done QE like never before. They have printed over $14 trillion in 2 years. So what do? Do they keep running the printing press and making inflation worse and worse and worse by running more and more printing? They can't. And if they do choose to do that, they're only going to be pouring gasoline on the fire. So the Fed is really in a tough predicament here. And we keep hearing them say like, oh, this is just going to flow through the economy. It's going to not be here forever sort of thing. But the data doesn't lie. The problem is when they tell us that this is going to change, it's going to go back to a different interest rate. When you actually look at the data, they've been saying transitory all along while this chart has been just going steadily up. And now we're at 7.9%. So there's actually a missing pole right there from this new March information. Well, February, it was released in March, but it's February. Now, that's another point I wanted to bring up in this video is that this is not including what had just happened overseas. So we're going to see that supply shock on oil is probably going to be affecting this month. It's going to be affecting the March figures, right? So I highly doubt that it's going to go from 7.9% with everything going on down to 7% or something along those lines. It's probably going to get over that 8% figure and get to 8.25, 8.3%. And that's, again, using their CPI. And if we use the real CPI, like I showed you on the shadow stats chart here, you would see that we are well above 15%, 16% on the CPI if we use the same figures back in the 80s, which is just scary that we're not being told the full truth of what's going on. And at the end of the day, they really don't have the tools there to stop this. And so what I'm wondering is, at some point, are they going to start running the printing press again? Because that's really the only option, or we have to, go through a recession. And really, a recession is kind of the painful medicine that is needed here, because there really isn't any way out from how much money printing they have done and what tools they have left. They can't do anything. The only thing they can do is go to negative rates, not raise the rates, go to negative rates, and then start the printing press back up again. And where is that going to end us? Just with worse inflation and worse problems, just pouring gasoline on this fire. So I wanted to make this video just to tell the real truth. It's not sugar-coated. It doesn't feel, it's not a great feeling when you actually find out what's going on here. And I don't think that the inflation is going to be stopping anytime soon. As a matter of fact, I think that it could just start going out of control. And then what's going to happen there is kind of the hot potato theory I've been talking about on my channel. I think that the money is flooding into dollars right now. It's selling out of risky equities, going into dollars, because equities are down quite a bit, especially like tech stocks like the NASDAQ is down quite a bit. If you're down on top of inflation, you're really hurting. So people are cutting their losses, going into the dollar. But the problem is the dollar is going to start putting pressure on from inflation is going to be on the dollar. So basically, if you have your money under your mattress, so to speak, at the bank, there's a fire brewing, and eventually that dollar is losing its purchasing power. As of right now, if you trust their figures, you're losing roughly 8% of your purchasing power year over year. So if you're sitting on 100K, you're going to have 92K in purchasing power the next year, and then it's going to compound on that if it stays up at these figures, which I would argue it's not going to be transitory and it's going to start compounding. Then if you actually use the real CPI figures that we used back in the 80s, it'll make you realize that we're up there over 15%. So if you had 100K, you're going to have 85K in purchasing power the next year if you're sitting on 100K. So what does that tell you? Everybody that's sitting on cash right now, cash will be king for the short term until that pain of inflation starts chipping away at that cash position. Then people are going to be playing hot potato with their dollars, which is when I think they're going to buy risk off safe haven assets with that dollar pile before it all burns away. That's the video. That's everything I wanted to talk about. Hopefully there's some fruitful information here. If there was, I would appreciate it if you take that 1 second to smash the like button and subscribe to the channel. Really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you at the next video.